Somewhere in Ohio right now, a factory owner named David is staring at a spreadsheet that doesn't add up. And 3,000 miles away in Washington, a Treasury Secretary is quietly negotiating something that could either save David's expansion plans or make his customers furious, and almost nobody watching the evening news has any idea these two things are connected. Here's the headline that should have made front pages everywhere, and mostly didn't. The United States and China are discussing something called a Board of Investment, a new mechanism that could funnel Chinese capital into American factories, American supply chains, and American industrial projects. At the exact same moment, Washington is telling its G7 allies that China is flooding the world with cheap exports and needs to be stopped. Read that sentence again. The same government that spent the better part of 2 years warning about Chinese economic aggression is now negotiating the terms under which Chinese money gets welcomed into non-sensitive corners of the American economy. That is not a contradiction born of confusion. That is the actual strategy, and understanding why requires you to throw out the simple story you've been told about America versus China and replace it with something far more complicated, far more interesting, and far more relevant to your own financial future than most people realize. In May of 2026, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent sat down with CNBC in Beijing and said something that lit up financial Twitter for about 6 hours before the news cycle moved on to the next crisis. He said the US and China were discussing a board of investment, a mechanism specifically designed to determine which non-sensitive industries Chinese companies could invest in without triggering a review from the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, the government body known as CFIUS, that normally screens foreign money for national security risk. Bessent was careful with his words. He did not confirm that China had pledged $1 trillion, and when pressed directly, he said he wasn't even sure where that number came from. But the fact that a $1 trillion figure was circulating at all, discussed seriously enough that a sitting Treasury Secretary had to publicly walk it back, tells you something about the scale of what's actually being negotiated behind closed doors. This wasn't some fringe policy floated by a junior staffer. This was the man who chairs CFIUS himself describing a new institutional pathway for Chinese capital to enter the American economy, deliberately designed to bypass the very committee he leads. Sit with that for a second, because it is one of the strangest moves in recent economic policy. Now picture David again, the Ohio manufacturer. His company wants to expand, build a new production line, maybe add a second facility. That kind of expansion needs capital, real capital, the kind that comes from somewhere. Right now, it might come from a bank loan, a private equity fund, or retained earnings, but under a framework like the one Bessent described. Some of that capital could eventually come from Chinese investors looking for a home for their money in industries considered safe enough to avoid scrutiny. Construction jobs, equipment orders, supplier contracts. All of it real, all of it tangible, all of it flowing from a source that half of Washington considers a strategic adversary. That's the paradox sitting at the center of this story, and it is not new, but it is intensifying in a way that deserves your attention. Because 2 weeks before that CNBC interview, at a G7 finance ministers meeting in Paris, the very same Scott Bessent was telling European counterparts something almost opposite in tone. He argued that Western economies needed stronger protections against a flood of Chinese industrial exports, warning that unchecked overcapacity coming out of China could seriously damage manufacturing sectors across Europe and other allied economies. He cited IMF data. He pushed hard. Japanese officials backed him up, arguing China wasn't showing willingness to correct its own imbalances. Chinese officials pushed back through their embassy in Washington, arguing that framing Chinese exports as a problem was really just Western economies trying to blame someone else for their own weak competitiveness and underinvestment. Both sides have a case, and we'll come back to that, but notice what's happening here. The same administration official, in the same month, is simultaneously trying to restrict the flow of Chinese goods into Western markets while trying to open a new channel for Chinese money into the American economy. Goods bad, capital may be okay. Products dangerous, dollars useful. That distinction is the whole ballgame, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it in every headline about this relationship going forward. Let's talk about why that distinction actually makes a strange kind of sense, even if it feels contradictory on the surface. China has built the most productive manufacturing base on the planet. By some European Commission estimates, China now accounts for roughly 30% of global manufacturing output, while representing only about 13% of global consumption. That gap between what China produces and what China consumes is the engine behind everything you're hearing about overcapacity. Factories built to serve a much larger share of global demand than China's own population can absorb, which means the surplus has to go somewhere, and it goes into export markets at prices that Western manufacturers often cannot match. Steel, electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels, electronics. The European Commission has projected that global steel overcapacity alone could reach 721 million tons by 2027, which is something like 5 times total EU steel consumption. When that much supply needs a buyer, prices get pushed down everywhere, and factories in Ohio, in Michigan, in Germany, and France start losing to competitors that can undercut them on cost. That is the export side of the ledger, and it's the side Washington and Brussels are trying to slow down with tariffs, anti-dumping investigations, and now proposals for something Europe is calling an overcapacity instrument, essentially their own version of the trade weapon the US built years ago. But investment is a different animal entirely. When Chinese capital builds a factory inside the United States, it doesn't compete with American production, it becomes American production. The jobs are American jobs. The tax base is an American tax base. The output counts toward American GDP. This is why Besant can simultaneously want less Chinese stuff crossing the border and more Chinese money crossing the border, because one displaces domestic workers and the other, in theory, employs them. It sounds almost elegant when you put it that way. For the industries deemed non-sensitive, it might actually work exactly like that. New factories, construction contracts, equipment purchases, skilled trade jobs, all flowing into American communities that have spent 2 decades watching manufacturing jobs disappear overseas. But here's where it gets genuinely complicated, and where the critics on Capitol Hill have a legitimate point worth taking seriously. Republican lawmakers, including the chair of the House Committee on China, have warned Besant directly that reviving market access for Chinese industrial firms could actually undercut the broader push to rebuild American manufacturing independence. Their argument goes something like this. If you let Chinese capital flow freely into non-sensitive sectors, you risk creating a version of dependency that looks different from the old kind, but functions similarly, where American industries become intertwined with Chinese ownership, Chinese supply chains, and ultimately Chinese leverage, even in areas that seem harmless today, but could become strategically important tomorrow. Battery technology looked non-sensitive a few years ago. Now it sits at the center of a national security fight. And that fight has a name attached to it that most viewers of financial news would actually recognize: Ford Motor Company. Back in 2023, Ford announced a partnership with CATL, the Chinese company that controls more than a third of the global EV battery market, to build a massive battery plant in Marshall, Michigan, using CATL's licensed technology for lithium iron phosphate batteries. The project promised thousands of jobs and received well over $1 billion in Michigan state incentives. Sounds exactly like the kind of investment story we've been describing: foreign expertise, American jobs, American soil. Except in January of 2025, the Pentagon added CATL to its list of companies with ties to the Chinese military under a designation required by federal law. CATL denied any military connection and called the designation a mistake. But the political fallout was immediate. Members of Congress, including the chair of the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party, argued that reliance on CATL batteries endangers national security by making critical American energy infrastructure dependent on a company tied to the Chinese state. Investigations found Ford planned to use software from multiple Chinese companies linked to both the Chinese military and North Korea's government in parts of the supply chain. Michigan state legislators started calling for a full reassessment of the project. Utility companies began phasing out CATL-produced storage batteries at sensitive sites, including one of the largest Marine Corps bases in the country. This is the cautionary tale sitting underneath every optimistic headline about Chinese investment revitalizing American manufacturing. The Marshall, Michigan plant is real. The jobs are real. The billion-dollar state investment is real. And so is the possibility that a company central to that investment has ties reaching into the Chinese military apparatus. Multiply that single case across an entire board of investment framework designed to fast-track deals into non-sensitive industries, and you start to understand exactly why lawmakers on both sides of the aisle are nervous, and why the word non-sensitive is doing an enormous amount of work in this entire conversation. Because who decides what counts as non-sensitive, and how confident can anyone really be that today's harmless industry doesn't become tomorrow's national security flashpoint? Now zoom out from Michigan and Ohio to the entire global chessboard, because the US-China investment relationship doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists inside a much bigger structural shift that most people have heard the word BRICS attached to without really understanding what's happening underneath it. BRICS originally stood for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, a term actually coined by a Goldman Sachs economist back in 2001 to describe a group of large emerging economies. Over the past 2 years, that grouping expanded dramatically, adding Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Indonesia, and others, turning a loose economic acronym into what's increasingly described as BRICS Plus, a coalition representing something like 40% of global GDP and nearly half the world's population. And the project these countries have increasingly coordinated around is what analysts call de-dollarization, not some overnight plan to replace the dollar with a single new currency, but a gradual, deliberate build-out of financial infrastructure that reduces dependency on the American financial system. The New Development Bank, founded back in 2014 as an alternative to the World Bank, is committed to conducting up to 30% of its lending in local currencies rather than dollars. Systems like BRICS Pay are linking together national payment networks, Russia's SPFS, China's CIPS, India's UPI, creating an infrastructure that lets member countries settle trade without ever routing a transaction through the American banking system or SWIFT. Russian officials have claimed that as much as 90% of Russia's trade settlements with other BRICS countries now happen in national currencies rather than dollars, largely a consequence of Western sanctions following the invasion of Ukraine, which froze roughly $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves and sent a chilling message to every other government watching that dollar-denominated reserves can become a political weapon overnight. That single event, more than any ideological commitment to multipolarity, is widely seen as the moment that accelerated central bank interest in diversifying away from dollar exposure. Now here's where you need actual numbers instead of vibes, because this topic gets sensationalized constantly, and the real data tells a more nuanced story than either side wants to admit. According to the IMF's own currency composition of official foreign exchange reserves data, the dollar's share of global reserves sat at roughly 57% in the first quarter of 2026. That is down from a peak north of 70% a couple decades ago, a real long-term decline worth taking seriously. But it's also true that in some recent quarters, that share actually ticked upward, driven mostly by exchange rate effects rather than central banks actively dumping dollar assets. Economists studying the data closely have found that a huge portion of the apparent swings in dollar share from quarter to quarter comes from currency valuation effects, not genuine portfolio reallocation, meaning the dramatic de-dollarization headlines you see online often overstate what's actually happening inside central bank vaults. The dollar still settles somewhere around 88 to 89% of global foreign exchange transactions. U.S. Treasury markets remain by far the deepest and most liquid government debt market on Earth. The Chinese yuan, despite years of promotion by Beijing, still holds only around 2% of global reserves. So, if you're waiting for some dramatic collapse of dollar dominance next year, the actual data doesn't support that particular panic. What the data does support is a slow, structural, multi-decade erosion, a world gradually building parallel financial infrastructure that didn't exist 20 years ago, giving countries options they never had before, even if most of them aren't using those options to fully abandon the dollar system just yet. This is the actual competition happening beneath the surface of every US-China headline you see, and it's bigger than tariffs, bigger than any single trade deal, bigger than any one summit between two presidents. It is a contest over who finances the next generation of global economic development. For decades, that role belonged almost entirely to Western institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, American and European banks, all operating within a dollar-denominated system, with conditions attached, often requiring policy reforms, austerity measures, or alignment with Western institutional preferences. China built an alternative through the Belt and Road Initiative, pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into ports, railways, and infrastructure across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Financing that came with far fewer strings attached to domestic governance, but sometimes came with its own risks, including debt burdens that critics argue leave recipient countries exposed to Chinese leverage down the road. The G7, recognizing it was losing ground in this competition for influence across the developing world, held a summit in Evian, France in June 2026 and issued a formal declaration on what they called mutually beneficial international partnerships, essentially acknowledging that traditional development aid models weren't cutting it anymore and that Western countries needed to mobilize far more private capital, offer better risk mitigation tools, and treat developing nations as genuine economic partners rather than aid recipients. Read between the lines of that diplomatic language, and what you're really seeing is the G7 admitting, in an official joint statement, that China's approach to financing the developing world had become competitive enough to force a response. That's not spin, that's not conspiracy theory, that's the G7's own words, acknowledging that the old system wasn't sufficient to meet the needs of the countries they were trying to keep in their orbit. So layer all of this together, and you start to see the real shape of the story hiding underneath that trillion-dollar headline. On one axis, you have the United States trying to attract Chinese capital into safe, controlled corners of its own economy to build factories and create jobs, while simultaneously trying to block Chinese goods from undercutting the same industries those factories are supposed to serve. On another axis, you have the G7 as a bloc trying to hold together a unified front against what they characterize as unsustainable Chinese trade imbalances, while individual member states quietly compete with each other for the very same Chinese investment dollars David's Ohio factory might someday depend on. And on a third axis entirely, you have BRICS plus building parallel financial infrastructure, not to declare war on the dollar system, but to make sure that if the dollar system ever gets weaponized against them the way it was against Russia, they have somewhere else to turn. None of these axes are separate stories. They're the same story, viewed from different capitals. Let's bring this back to something that actually matters for your wallet, because it's easy to treat all of this as abstract geopolitics happening in conference rooms in Paris and Beijing, but the consequences show up in very concrete ways. If Chinese investment does flow more freely into non-sensitive American industries, you could see real benefits, new factories, construction jobs, expanded local tax bases, communities getting a second wind after decades of industrial decline. Some of that is already happening. Chinese foreign direct investment data out of Beijing shows actually utilized American investment into China rose more than 24% year over year in early 2026, though that's investment flowing the other direction, showing their relationship isn't simply one way. On the flip side, if tariffs and trade protections tighten further to counter Chinese export overcapacity, prices on certain consumer goods, particularly electronics, batteries, and eventually vehicles, could climb higher than they would in a fully open trading system, because tariffs are ultimately a tax that gets passed through supply chains and often lands on the consumer at checkout. Rare earth elements sit right in the middle of this tension too, and they matter more than most people realize. China controls somewhere close to 90% of global rare earth processing capacity, the specialized refining that turns raw ore into the materials needed for everything from electric vehicle motors to fighter jet components to MRI machines. When China tightened export controls on these materials through 2025, prices in some markets reportedly spiked as much as 6 times higher, and industries across multiple sectors, especially automotive, faced real production disruptions. As part of the trade truce reached between Trump and Xi in Busan back in October 2025, China agreed to suspend the most aggressive wave of those export controls for a year, and that suspension was later extended into November 2026. That single concession, quietly negotiated and rarely explained clearly in mainstream coverage, prevented what could have been a much more painful supply chain crisis across multiple American industries. The United States, meanwhile, has been racing to build alternative rare earth supply chains through partnerships with Australia, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and other countries. But experts are blunt about the timeline. Mining and processing infrastructure takes years to build, and self-sufficiency in this specific sector remains a genuinely long road, not a quick fix that shows up in next quarter's headlines. This is why the framing of America versus China misses so much of what's actually happening. It's not a binary conflict where one side wins and the other loses. It's a messy, overlapping set of negotiations happening across trade, investment, technology, currency, and supply chains simultaneously, where the same two governments are adversaries in one column and reluctant economic partners in another column. Sometimes on the very same day, sometimes in the very same meeting. Scott Bessent didn't fly to Beijing to declare economic war, and he didn't fly there to declare economic friendship either. He flew there to negotiate the terms of an uneasy coexistence between two economies so deeply intertwined that full separation would be economically catastrophic for both sides, even as each government works furiously behind the scenes to reduce its dependency on the other wherever it strategically can. That's the real headline, even though it doesn't fit into 6 words on a chyron. Consider what happened during Trump's actual visit to Beijing in May 2026, the visit where Bessent made his Board of Investment comments in the first place. The two sides didn't produce a sweeping new trade agreement. They produced something far more modest, and in some ways, far more telling. An agreement to establish both a Board of Trade and a Board of Investment. New institutional plumbing rather than a grand bargain. China committed to purchasing agricultural products, including a pledge of at least $17 billion a year, on top of earlier soybean purchase commitments made back in the October 2025 truce, and an initial order for 200 American-made Boeing aircraft. Xi Jinping talked about building what both sides called a constructive relationship of strategic stability. Analysts at places like the Atlantic Council described the summit as delivering real results, particularly around Beijing rolling back its most aggressive rare earth restrictions, while analysts at Brookings were far more skeptical, arguing the two leaders reached little more than a shallow truce with limited concrete deliverables, leaving enough ambiguity that both governments could claim victory at home while kicking the harder decisions further down the road. Both readings are probably true at the same time. That's usually how these things work. A truce that buys time, calms markets in the short term, and leaves the fundamental tension completely unresolved for whoever has to deal with it next. So where does this actually leave someone like David in Ohio? Or honestly, where does it leave you? Watching this unfold from wherever you happen to be sitting right now, it leaves you in a world where the old categories, ally, rival, trading partner, competitor, don't cleanly apply anymore. China is simultaneously the country the Pentagon is worried about supplying components for advanced weapon systems, and the country Michigan legislators fought over for a billion-dollar battery plant, and the country whose capital Scott Bessent is actively trying to attract into non-sensitive American industries, and the country the G7 is coordinating trade defenses against, all at the exact same time, none of those roles canceling out the others. The G7's own June 2026 declaration essentially admits that the traditional Western-led development finance model needs urgent reform to keep pace with the alternatives China and its BRICS partners have built. BRICS Plus, meanwhile, keeps expanding its membership and its payment infrastructure, not fast enough to dethrone the dollar in the next few years, but steadily enough that the structural balance of global finance 20 years from now could look meaningfully different from the balance we've lived under since Bretton Woods. And in the middle of all of it sits this strange new institution, a board of investment, quietly being negotiated behind closed doors in Beijing hotel rooms and Washington conference calls, designed to let Chinese capital flow into American factories without tripping the wires of the national security apparatus, at the exact moment lawmakers on Capitol Hill are warning that the wires exist for a reason and shouldn't be loosened casually. Whether that framework ends up building the next generation of American manufacturing jobs, or ends up creating the kind of quiet dependency that blindsides policymakers a decade from now, the way KATL's ties blindsided Michigan legislators who thought they were just landing a battery plant, is genuinely an open question. And it's one that will get answered gradually, deal by deal, factory by factory, industry classification by industry classification, mostly out of public view, mostly without a dramatic headline attached, which is exactly why almost nobody is paying attention to it, even though it might matter more to the next decade of American manufacturing than almost anything currently dominating the news cycle. The real story was never a trillion-dollar number that Bessent himself couldn't confirm. The real story is that the world's two largest economies are trying to figure out how to stay economically entangled enough to avoid catastrophe while decoupling enough to avoid vulnerability, and building entirely new institutions, boards, frameworks, and financial infrastructure just to manage that contradiction in real time, while a parallel financial world quietly builds itself around them, whether Washington fully reckons with it or not. That is the world David's factory sits inside of right now. That is the world your investment portfolio sits inside of right now. And that is the world every trade headline you scroll past for the rest of this year is actually describing, even when the headline itself makes it sound so much simpler than it really is. And if you want proof that this isn't just a Washington-Beijing story, look at what's happening in Europe at the exact same time, because Brussels is running its own version of this contradiction and getting messier results than Washington so far. The European Union imposed tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles back in 2024, ranging anywhere from about 17% up to 35%, or higher, depending on the manufacturer and how much state subsidy investigators believed each company had received. On paper, it looked like a clean policy win. BYD, which faced a lower tariff rate around 17%, kept growing its European sales aggressively, registering well over 100,000 new vehicles across the EU, UK, European Free Trade Association markets in just the first 5 months of 2026 alone, an increase of more than 145% compared to the same period a year earlier. Meanwhile, SAIC, which faced a much steeper 35% tariff, saw its European sales nearly cut in half. So the tariffs clearly changed behavior, but they didn't stop the overall trend because Chinese manufacturers simply adapted, quadrupling their exports of plug-in hybrid vehicles specifically because that category faced different, often lighter, tariff treatment than fully electric models, effectively routing around the wall Brussels built. Transport and environment researchers tracking this closely concluded that the tariffs worked in the narrow sense of protecting certain European and American automakers from the very worst of the price pressure, but failed in the broader sense of actually stemming the underlying flow of overcapacity-driven Chinese vehicle exports into the European market. Some Chinese brands responded by doing exactly what Beijing's critics feared, and Beijing's defenders welcomed simultaneously. They started building factories directly inside Europe, which sidesteps the tariff entirely because the vehicle is no longer technically an import. It becomes local production, employing local workers. Exactly the same logic driving the American Board of Investment conversation. France has emerged as the loudest voice in Europe, pushing back harder, with President Macron warning after a December 2025 trip to Beijing that Europe could eventually be forced into a genuine decoupling from China in strategic sectors if Beijing didn't address the widening imbalance. And Paris has pushed hard to keep currency distortions and global trade imbalances on the G7's permanent agenda, rather than letting the topic quietly fade after each summit ends. But smaller European countries, particularly in Southern and Central Europe, where economies depend more heavily on inbound Chinese capital for everything from ports to renewable energy infrastructure, have resisted the push for tougher foreign investment screening, worried that slamming the door on Chinese money now costs them more than it protects them. That's the exact same tension playing out in Washington between lawmakers who want strict CFIS scrutiny on every Chinese dollar and an administration actively trying to carve out a faster lane for the same money, just wearing different national colors. Now think about semiconductors for a second, because this is the sector where the stakes of getting the sensitive versus non-sensitive line wrong are highest of all. Advanced chips sit at the center of artificial intelligence development, military targeting systems, and basically every piece of modern infrastructure you can name, which is exactly why the United States has maintained some of its tightest export controls specifically around cutting-edge semiconductor technology and the equipment used to manufacture it, even while simultaneously courting Chinese investment dollars into industries considered comparatively harmless, like consumer manufacturing or basic industrial equipment. The distinction sounds clean in a press release. It is much messier in practice because supply chains rarely respect the clean boundaries policymakers draw on paper. A factory building something as mundane as household appliances still needs semiconductors somewhere in its components, still needs software, still needs logistics systems that may run through Chinese-linked technology providers. The same way Ford's Michigan battery plant turned out to involve software from companies with military and North Korean government ties buried several layers down in the supply chain. A connection that congressional investigators only uncovered after digging deep into subcontractor relationships. Nobody at the state level had scrutinized when the incentive package was first approved. That's the practical problem hiding underneath every optimistic Board of Investment press release. The line between sensitive and non-sensitive isn't a wall, it's a permeable membrane. And the people drawing that line today are making judgment calls about technologies and supply chain relationships that may not fully reveal their strategic importance for another 5 or 10 years. The same way, lithium-ion battery technology looked purely commercial a decade ago, and now sits at the center of national security hearings. So here's the honest, unglamorous conclusion underneath all of this. There's no version of this story where America simply wins or simply loses, and there's no version where China simply wins or simply loses either, because both governments are threading an incredibly narrow needle at the same time, trying to capture the economic benefits of interdependence while minimizing the strategic vulnerabilities that come attached to it. And neither side has found a clean way to do that yet, which is precisely why you keep seeing headlines that contradict each other within the same week. Tariffs going up while investment boards get proposed, rare earth controls suspended while chip export bans stay firmly in place, G7 finance ministers demanding protection from Chinese exports, while Chinese FDI into non-sensitive American sectors quietly climbs. Every one of those headlines is true. None of them tells the whole story by itself. The whole story only comes into focus when you stop looking for a single winner and start watching the actual mechanics, the boards being built, the tariffs being calibrated, industry by industry, the payment systems being quietly linked together in Moscow and Beijing and New Delhi, the reshoring numbers climbing in the American South, the rare earth supply chains being painstakingly rebuilt in Australia and Saudi Arabia over years rather than months. That is the real trend, playing out in dozens of smaller stories that rarely make it past the business section. And it is worth understanding now, because whether you're running a factory in Ohio, managing a retirement portfolio, or just trying to understand why the price of your next car keeps shifting for reasons that have nothing to do with your local dealership, you are already living inside the outcome of exactly this negotiation, whether anyone explained it to you clearly or not.